Jake Morrison believed he owned the streets of Millfield. Every morning at exactly 7:30, the roar of his black Harley-Davidson would shatter the peaceful quiet of the suburban neighborhood. The motorcycle was his pride and joy, a beast of metal and chrome that announced his presence 3 blocks away. Jake loved the way people jumped when he revved the engine. He loved how mothers grabbed their children closer when he rode past. Most of all, he loved the power he felt when fear flickered across someone's face. At 28 years old, Jake had the appearance of someone much tougher than he actually was. His leather jacket was covered in patches from motorcycle clubs he had never belonged to. The Skull and Bones patch on his back was bought online for $15. The Iron Warrior's emblem on his sleeve came from a gas station gift shop. His beard was scraggly and unkempt, and his dark hair hung in greasy strands beneath his black bandana. When Jake walked into a room, he wanted people to think he was dangerous. The truth was different. Jake worked at Murphy's auto repair shop on the edge of town, changing oil and fixing flat tires. His coworkers knew him as someone who talked big, but never backed it up. He lived alone in a small apartment above Tony's Pizza, where the smell of pepperoni and cheese seeped through his floorboards every night. Jake had no real friends, no girlfriend, and no exciting stories to tell. The motorcycle and the tough guy act were his way of feeling important in a life that had become disappointingly ordinary. But Jake had discovered something that gave him a twisted sense of entertainment. He had learned that scaring animals, especially dogs, filled the empty hours of his day with amusement. It had started accidentally 6 months ago when a small terrier had barked at his motorcycle. Jake had revved the engine as a joke, and the little dog had run away yelping. Something about that moment had excited Jake in a way he did not fully understand. From that day forward, Jake began targeting pets around Millfield. He would ride slowly through residential streets, looking for dogs in yards or being walked by their owners. When he spotted a target, Jake would gun his engine or honk his horn, delighting in the way the animals would jump or cower. The fear in their eyes gave him a rush that his boring life otherwise lacked. As weeks passed, Jake grew bolder. He started getting off his motorcycle to get closer to the animals. At first, he would just stomp his boots on the ground to startle them. Then he began making sudden movements with his arms, watching dogs scramble backward in terror. The owners usually pulled their pets away quickly, shooting angry looks at Jake, but no one ever confronted him directly. This made Jake feel even more powerful. The neighborhood of Millfield was perfect for Jake's cruel hobby. Tree-lined streets were filled with families who loved their pets like children. Golden retrievers played in fenced yards. Elderly couples walked small lapdogs every evening. Children rode bicycles with family cats following behind. It was a paradise for someone who enjoyed disrupting peace and happiness. Jake had his favorite spots around town. The corner of Maple and Pine Street was where Mrs. Henderson walked her golden retriever every morning. The dog park on Elm Street was busy with families on weekends. The walking trail behind the elementary school saw dozens of dog walkers every afternoon. Jake would position himself at these locations, timing his appearances to maximize the fear he could create. What Jake did not realize was that his reputation was growing. Pet owners were starting to talk to each other about the mean man on the motorcycle who seemed to enjoy frightening their beloved animals. Stories were being shared at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, and over backyard fences. A pattern was emerging, and people were getting angry. But Jake was too pleased with himself to notice the storm clouds gathering around him. Tuesday morning brought another opportunity for Jake to practice his twisted hobby. He had been watching Mrs. Henderson and her golden retriever buddy for weeks now. Every day at 8:15 sharp, the elderly woman would emerge from her blue house on Maple Street with the friendly dog trotting beside her. Buddy was the kind of dog that made everyone smile. His golden fur caught the sunlight like spun gold, and his tail wagged constantly, as if the whole world was his best friend. Jake had noticed that Buddy would approach anyone who seemed friendly. The dog had even tried to greet Jake once, but the roar of the motorcycle had sent the poor animal scrambling behind his owner. That moment had planted a seed in Jake's mind. He realized he could use Buddy's trusting nature against him. On this particular Tuesday, Jake positioned his motorcycle at the corner where Maple Street met Oak Avenue. He pretended to be checking his phone, but his eyes were fixed on Mrs. Henderson's front door. Right on schedule, the door opened and out came the old woman with her beloved companion. Mrs. Henderson was 72 years old and had been walking dogs in this neighborhood for 40 years. First it was Rusty, then Belle, and now Buddy. She loved these morning walks because they connected her with neighbors and gave her a chance to enjoy the peaceful streets she had called home for decades. Mrs. Henderson had no idea that someone was deliberately planning to frighten her precious dog. As they approached the corner, Jake started his motorcycle but kept the engine quiet. Buddy's ears perked up at the sound, but the dog showed no fear. Instead, his curious nature drew him toward the interesting man sitting on the big machine. This was exactly what Jake had been hoping for. Mrs. Henderson was distracted by her neighbor, Mr. Collins, who had come out to get his newspaper. The two elderly people began chatting about the weather and their gardens. This gave Jake the perfect opportunity to put his cruel plan into action. Buddy wandered closer to the motorcycle, his tail still wagging. The innocent dog had no reason to expect anything bad from this stranger. In Buddy's simple understanding of the world, people were generally kind and motorcycles were just loud but harmless machines. Jake waited until Buddy was within 3 feet of his motorcycle. Then he quickly lifted his heavy boot and kicked it out toward the unsuspecting dog. His boot missed Buddy by only inches, but the sudden movement and the whoosh of air terrified the gentle animal. Buddy yelped in fear and scrambled backward so fast that he tumbled onto the sidewalk. The sound of her dog's frightened cry immediately caught Mrs. Henderson's attention. She spun around to see Buddy cowering behind a mailbox, his whole body shaking. The golden retriever's eyes were wide with terror, and his tail had stopped wagging for the first time anyone could remember. Jake quickly pretended to be adjusting something on his motorcycle, acting as if nothing had happened. When Mrs. Henderson looked at him with suspicion, he gave her an innocent shrug and said he was just fixing a loose part. But the cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth told a different story. Mrs. Henderson knew something was wrong. Buddy had never acted this way before. The dog refused to continue their walk and kept looking fearfully at the man on the motorcycle. She had to practically carry her trembling pet back to their house, her heart breaking at seeing her normally happy companion so frightened. This successful scare gave Jake a rush of excitement that lasted the entire day. He had managed to terrorize an innocent animal right under its owner's nose without getting caught. The power he felt was intoxicating, and he immediately began planning his next target. Jake did not realize that Mrs. Henderson was not a woman who would forget this incident easily. By Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Henderson could not stop thinking about what had happened to Buddy. Her golden retriever had been acting strange ever since their encounter with the motorcycle man. The normally cheerful dog now refused to go on their regular walks. When Mrs. Henderson tried to lead him outside, Buddy would plant his feet firmly on the kitchen floor and whimper softly. The sound of any motorcycle in the distance would send him running to hide under the dining room table. Mrs. Henderson decided she needed to talk to someone about this troubling change in her beloved pet. She put on her best blue dress and walked to the grocery store on Main Street, hoping to run into some of her neighbors. The Millfield Market was the heart of neighborhood gossip, where information flowed as freely as the coffee from the small cafe in the corner. As luck would have it, Sarah Collins was selecting apples near the front of the store. Sarah lived 2 streets over and was known for her 3 cats and her volunteer work at the animal shelter. Mrs. Henderson approached her with a worried expression and began explaining Buddy's sudden behavioral changes. Sarah listened carefully as Mrs. Henderson described the incident with the motorcycle man. As the story unfolded, Sarah's face grew more and more concerned. When Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, Sarah shook her head slowly and said she had experienced something very similar with her own pets. Just 3 days earlier, Sarah had been in her front yard watering flowers while her cat Whiskers sunbathed on the porch steps. A man on a loud motorcycle had stopped at the corner and revved his engine repeatedly while staring directly at her house. Whiskers had been so frightened that he had run inside and hidden under Sarah's bed for the rest of the day. Since then, the normally social cat refused to go outside and would panic whenever he heard motorcycle engines. The two women compared notes and realized they were describing the same person. A man in his late 20s with a scraggly beard, wearing a black leather jacket covered in patches, riding a particularly loud Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Both women agreed that his behavior seemed deliberate and cruel. Their conversation attracted the attention of Tom Bradley, who was shopping for dog food in the next aisle. Tom overheard them talking about pet problems and joined the discussion. He had his own disturbing story to share about his German shepherd named Rex. Rex had always been a confident and fearless dog. The large shepherd had never backed down from anything in his 6 years of life. But last week, something had changed dramatically. Tom had been walking Rex near the corner of Pine and Maple Streets when a motorcycle had approached them. The rider had gotten off his bike and made sudden aggressive movements toward Rex, while making loud noises. The normally brave dog had cowered and tried to hide behind Tom's legs. Since that incident, Rex had refused to walk past that particular corner. The proud German shepherd now trembled and whined whenever they approached the area where the encounter had occurred. Tom was baffled by his dog's sudden fear and had been considering taking Rex to a veterinarian to see if something was physically wrong. As the three neighbors shared their experiences, a pattern became crystal clear. The same motorcycle rider was deliberately targeting pets throughout their neighborhood. His actions were not random pranks but calculated acts of cruelty designed to frighten innocent animals. Maria Santos joined their impromptu meeting after overhearing their conversation. She had her own heartbreaking story about her rescue dog, Luna. The small mixed breed had survived abuse before Maria adopted her from the shelter. Luna had been making wonderful progress in learning to trust people again, but recently she had stopped eating and returned to the fearful behavior she had shown when first rescued. The four pet owners were angry and frustrated. They felt helpless against someone who seemed to take pleasure in terrorizing their beloved companions. They agreed to document any future incidents and report them to the police, though they worried that without clear evidence of actual contact, law enforcement might not take their complaints seriously. The old Victorian house at the end of Oak Street had been empty for 6 months. Its peeling paint and overgrown garden made it look forgotten and sad. So when a small moving truck pulled up on Friday evening, several neighbors peeked through their curtains to see who would be moving into the neglected property. The new resident appeared to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was small in stature, but moved with purpose as she directed the movers carrying boxes and furniture into the house. She wore simple clothes and comfortable walking shoes, and she seemed to prefer staying in the background rather than drawing attention to herself. Elena Rodriguez had spent the last 3 decades as a veterinarian in the busy city of Chicago. She had treated thousands of animals during her career, from routine checkups to emergency surgeries. She had also seen the darker side of human nature through cases of animal abuse and neglect. After 30 years of healing injured and traumatized creatures, Elena had decided it was time to retire to a quiet place where she could finally rest. Millfield had seemed perfect when she visited 6 months earlier. The tree-lined streets and peaceful atmosphere reminded her of the small town where she had grown up. Elena had purchased the Victorian house sight unseen, planning to spend her retirement reading books, tending a garden, and enjoying the simple pleasures she had missed during her demanding career. But within her first week in Millfield, Elena began to notice things that troubled her deeply. During her evening walks around the neighborhood, she observed several dogs that showed clear signs of stress and trauma. As a veterinarian, Elena could read animal behavior like other people read books. She saw the telltale signs in their body language, their movement patterns, and their reactions to everyday sounds. There was the golden retriever on Maple Street who flinched at every noise and refused to walk past certain corners. The German shepherd on Pine Street displayed classic symptoms of anxiety, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting danger. A small rescue dog she glimpsed through a window showed behaviors she had seen in severely traumatized animals at her clinic. Alina's professional instincts told her that these animals were suffering from recent psychological trauma. In her experience, such widespread fear among pets in a single neighborhood usually meant one of two things. Either there had been some kind of natural disaster that frightened the animals, or someone was deliberately causing them harm. Since there had been no storms, fireworks, or other obvious events that might have scared multiple pets, Alina suspected the latter. She had dealt with cases of animal cruelty throughout her career, and she knew how to recognize the patterns. Someone in this peaceful neighborhood was terrorizing innocent animals for their own twisted entertainment. Alina decided to investigate further. She began varying her walking routes and times, observing the neighborhood from different angles. She struck up conversations with pet owners she met, casually asking about their animals' health and behavior. The stories she heard confirmed her worst suspicions. Mrs. Henderson told her about Buddy's sudden fear of motorcycles and his refusal to continue their daily walks. Sarah Collins mentioned how her cat Whiskers had become a nervous wreck after an encounter with a threatening stranger. Tom Bradley described his German Shepherd's inexplicable terror of certain street corners. Each story added another piece to the puzzle Alina was assembling in her mind. She had heard similar accounts dozens of times during her career, usually when investigating cases of systematic animal abuse. The pattern was always the same: a predator who targeted vulnerable creatures for the sense of power it gave them. Alina felt the familiar anger rising in her chest that she had experienced whenever confronting animal cruelty. She had thought those days were behind her when she retired, but apparently fate had other plans. The protective instincts that had driven her to become a veterinarian in the first place were awakening once again. Alina had spent 3 decades defending creatures who could not defend themselves. She had testified in court against animal abusers, worked with police to prosecute cases of cruelty, and dedicated her life to healing the victims of human brutality. She was not about to let some coward terrorize the pets of her new neighborhood without consequences. But Alina was also smart enough to know that she needed evidence and a solid plan before taking action. She would need to be patient, observant, and strategic if she wanted to stop whoever was causing this suffering. Alina began her investigation the very next morning. She woke before sunrise and prepared for what she knew would be a long day of careful observation. In her kitchen, she packed a small bag with a thermos of coffee, some granola bars, and most importantly, her phone with a fully charged battery. During her years as a veterinarian, Alina had learned that documentation was everything when building a case against animal abusers. She decided to start at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, where several neighbors had mentioned troubling incidents. Alina found a bench at the small park across the street and settled in with a newspaper as her cover. To anyone watching, she would appear to be a retiree enjoying a peaceful morning in the park. In reality, she was conducting surveillance with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades observing both animal and human behavior. At 7:45, Alina spotted her first suspect. A man in his late 20s rode a loud black Harley-Davidson motorcycle down Maple Street. His leather jacket was covered with patches, and his scraggly beard matched the description she had heard from worried pet owners. Alina watched as he slowed down near Mrs. Henderson's house, clearly looking for something or someone. Right on schedule, Mrs. Henderson emerged with Buddy. Alina observed the interaction carefully through her sunglasses. She saw how the motorcycle rider positioned himself strategically and waited for the perfect moment to act. When Mrs. Henderson was distracted by a neighbor, Alina watched in horror as Jake kicked his boot toward the unsuspecting golden retriever. Alina's hands trembled with anger as she took several photos with her phone. The pictures clearly showed Jake's aggressive movement toward Buddy and the dog's terrified reaction. She had her first piece of solid evidence, but she knew she would need much more to build a strong case. Over the following week, Alina established a routine of observation. She learned that Jake worked at Murphy's Auto Repair and lived above Tony's Pizza on Main Street. She discovered his schedule and favorite routes through the neighborhood. Most importantly, she documented his pattern of targeting innocent pets when their owners were not looking. Elena witnessed Jake terrorizing a small poodle named Daisy while her owner was distracted by mail. She photographed him making threatening gestures toward a friendly beagle named Charlie during the dog's afternoon walk. She recorded video of him deliberately revving his engine to frighten Sarah Collins' cat Whiskers as the animal tried to enjoy some sunshine on the front porch. Each incident was carefully documented with photos, videos, and detailed written notes. Elena included dates, times, locations, and descriptions of both Jake's actions and the animal's reactions. She was building a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. But documentation was only part of Elena's plan. She also began researching Jake Morrison himself. Through casual conversations with neighbors and some discreet inquiries around town, Elena learned about Jake's background, his job, his living situation, and most importantly, his personality weaknesses. Elena discovered that Jake's motorcycle had been having mechanical problems lately. She overheard him complaining to a friend about brake issues and strange noises coming from the engine. Jake had mentioned that he did not trust other mechanics to work on his precious bike, preferring to fix problems himself even though his skills were limited. This information gave Elena an idea that made her smile for the first time since beginning her investigation. She remembered Marcus Thompson, a retired police officer she had worked with on several animal cruelty cases back in Chicago. Marcus now ran a training facility for rescue dogs, teaching them to overcome trauma and even training some for law enforcement work. Elena picked up her phone and called Marcus. After catching up on old times, she explained the situation in Millfield and asked if he might be interested in helping her teach a bully a lesson he would never forget. Marcus listened to her plan and immediately agreed to help. He had 3 dogs in mind who would be perfect for what Elena had in mind. Bruno was a massive German Shepherd mix who looked intimidating, but was actually gentle as a lamb. Stella was a brilliant border collie who could follow complex commands and read human behavior with remarkable accuracy. Tank was a muscular pit bull rescue who had overcome his own trauma to become a therapy dog, though his appearance still made people nervous. All 3 dogs were perfectly trained and would only respond to specific signals from Marcus. They were not aggressive animals, but they knew how to project an intimidating presence when necessary. More importantly, they understood the difference between real threats and theatrical performance. Elena and Marcus spent hours planning every detail of their operation. They would give Jake Morrison a taste of his own medicine by surrounding him with dogs and letting him experience the same fear he had been inflicting on innocent animals. Marcus Thompson arrived in Millfield on a Thursday evening, driving a large van with 3 specially trained dogs. Elena met him at the abandoned gas station on the edge of town, where they could discuss their final preparations without being seen by curious neighbors. As Marcus opened the back doors of his van, Elena got her first look at the animals who would help deliver justice to Jake Morrison. Bruno was even more impressive in person than Marcus had described. The German Shepherd mix stood nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, with intelligent dark eyes and a coat that was perfectly groomed. Despite his intimidating size, Bruno's tail wagged gently when Elena approached, and he allowed her to pet his massive head with the patience of a gentle giant. Stella was a beautiful border collie with striking black and white markings and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Elena could tell immediately that this dog was exceptionally smart. Stella watched Elena's every movement and seemed to be studying her, trying to understand what role she would play in whatever was about to happen. Tank was the most surprising of the 3 dogs. The muscular pit bull had scars on his face and chest that told the story of a difficult past, but his eyes were kind and his demeanor was calm. Elena knew from her veterinary experience that this dog had been through trauma but had emerged stronger and more compassionate because of it. Marcus explained that all 3 dogs had been trained to respond to subtle hand signals and voice commands. They could appear threatening when necessary but would never actually harm anyone unless there was real danger. These dogs understood the difference between performing and protecting, and they were masters of controlled intimidation. Elena and Marcus spent an hour going over the signals and commands the dogs would respond to during their operation. Alina practiced the hand gestures until she could execute them smoothly and naturally. They discussed timing, positioning, and backup plans in case something went wrong. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Alina had been monitoring Jake's routines for 2 weeks and knew exactly when and where he was most likely to stop his motorcycle for maintenance checks. His bike had been making concerning noises lately, and Jake's mechanical paranoia would work perfectly to their advantage. On Friday morning, Alina made an anonymous phone call to Murphy's Auto Repair. She disguised her voice and claimed to be a concerned citizen who had witnessed someone tampering with a motorcycle in their parking lot. She described Jake's bike in detail and suggested that the owner should check it immediately for possible sabotage. The call had exactly the effect Alina had hoped for. Jake became worried about his precious motorcycle and decided to take it for a test ride around the neighborhood to make sure everything was working properly. Alina and Marcus were ready for him. They positioned themselves at strategic locations along Jake's usual route. Alina hid behind a large oak tree at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, while Marcus concealed himself and the 3 dogs behind a hedgerow about 50 yards away. They had clear lines of sight to each other and could communicate using predetermined signals. Alina's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus confirming that he was in position with Bruno, Stella, and Tank. The dogs were calm and ready, waiting for their cue to begin the most important performance of their lives. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, Alina heard the distinctive roar of Jake's Harley-Davidson approaching from the south. She peered around the oak tree and saw him riding slowly, clearly listening for the mechanical problems that had been troubling him. As Alina had predicted, Jake pulled over at the corner to investigate the strange noises his bike was making. Alina watched as Jake climbed off his motorcycle and bent down to examine the engine. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She raised her hand and gave Marcus the first signal they had practiced. It was time to begin Jake's education in empathy and fear. Marcus quietly opened the gate that led from the hedgerow to the street. Bruno emerged first, moving with the silent grace of a predator despite his massive size. Stella followed, her border collie intelligence allowing her to read the situation instantly. Tank brought up the rear, his muscular frame and scarred face completing the intimidating trio. The 3 dogs moved into formation exactly as they had been trained. They approached Jake slowly and deliberately, forming a semicircle around him while he was still focused on his motorcycle. Alina held her breath as the most crucial part of their plan began to unfold. Jake was completely absorbed in examining his motorcycle when the 3 dogs took their positions around him. He was crouched beside his bike, running his hands along the engine and listening for the grinding noise that had been bothering him all week. The leather of his jacket creaked as he moved, and his boots scraped against the concrete sidewalk as he shifted his weight. The first sign that something was wrong came when Jake noticed that the usual neighborhood sounds had suddenly stopped. No birds were chirping, no cars were passing by, and even the wind seemed to have died down. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that makes people look up from whatever they are doing because some primitive instinct tells them they are no longer alone. Jake slowly raised his head and found himself staring directly into the dark brown eyes of Bruno, the massive German Shepherd mix. The dog was standing less than 6 feet away, perfectly still, watching Jake with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Bruno's ears were pricked forward in alert attention, and his large head was tilted slightly to one side, as if he were studying an interesting specimen. Jake's heart rate immediately jumped, but he tried to maintain his tough guy composure. He had spent years intimidating others, and he was not about to let some dog make him look weak. Jake straightened up slowly, trying to appear confident despite the sudden nervousness he felt creeping up his spine. That was when Jake noticed Stella, the border collie, positioned to his left. She was sitting calmly with her tail curled around her front paws, but her piercing gaze never left Jake's face. There was something almost human about the intelligence in her eyes, as if she could see right through his leather jacket facade to the coward underneath. Jake turned his head to the right, and his breath caught in his throat. Tank, The scared pit bull was standing there like a statue carved from muscle and determination. The dog's previous injuries were clearly visible across his face and chest, telling a story of survival that made Jake's tough guy act seem like a child's game of dress-up. For the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt genuinely afraid. He was completely surrounded by 3 large dogs who had appeared as if from nowhere. They were not growling or showing their teeth, but their silent presence was somehow more terrifying than any display of aggression would have been. Jake tried to take a step backward, but his motorcycle was directly behind him, blocking his escape route. The dogs seemed to sense his movement and adjusted their positions accordingly, maintaining their triangular formation around him. It was as if they were working together with a level of coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Bruno took a single step closer to Jake, and the man felt his knees go weak. The German Shepherd mix was enormous up close, easily weighing twice as much as any dog Jake had ever encountered. Bruno's massive head reached nearly to Jake's chest, and his powerful shoulders rippled with muscle beneath his thick coat. Jake's mouth went dry as he realized he was experiencing the same helpless terror that he had been inflicting on innocent pets for months. His hands began to shake, and sweat started beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. The irony of the situation was completely lost on him in that moment of pure fear. Stella made a soft sound, somewhere between a whine and a growl, that seemed to communicate something to the other 2 dogs. Tank shifted his weight slightly, and Bruno's ears moved forward another inch. To Jake, it felt like they were having a conversation about him, deciding what to do with this human who had stumbled into their territory. Jake tried to speak, to say something that might diffuse the tension, but his voice came out as nothing more than a frightened croak. He cleared his throat and tried again, but the words would not come. His tough guy vocabulary seemed completely inadequate for this situation. The 3 dogs maintained their positions with the patience of experienced hunters. They were not in any hurry to move or act, content to simply exist in Jake's space and let him feel the weight of their presence. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Jake stood trapped in their triangle of silent intimidation. Elena watched from her hiding place behind the oak tree, carefully monitoring both Jake's reactions and the dog's behavior. She could see that her plan was working perfectly. Jake was experiencing exactly the kind of fear and helplessness that he had been causing other creatures, and the lesson was clearly having an impact on him. Marcus remained hidden behind the hedgerow, ready to call off the dogs instantly if the situation escalated beyond what they had planned. But he could see that Bruno, Stella, and Tank were performing their roles with perfect discipline, creating maximum psychological impact without crossing any lines into actual aggression. Jake's confident smirk, the one that had intimidated so many pet owners over the past months, completely disappeared from his face. In its place was an expression of pure terror that transformed his entire appearance. The tough guy mask he had worn for years crumbled away, revealing the frightened and insecure person he had always been underneath. Bruno chose that moment to let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to start deep in his chest and vibrate through the air between them. The sound was not angry or aggressive, but it carried the unmistakable message that this was a creature capable of incredible power if provoked. Jake felt the growl in his bones, and his whole body began to tremble. Stella remained perfectly still, but her intelligent eyes never stopped studying Jake's face. The border collie seemed to be reading every micro-expression, every sign of fear and weakness that crossed his features. There was something deeply unsettling about being watched so intently by such an obviously intelligent animal. Tank moved for the first time since taking his position. The muscular pit bull simply shifted his weight from one paw to the other, but the movement drew Jake's attention to the dog's incredible physical power. Tank's shoulders and chest were built like those of a heavyweight boxer, and the scars on his face told the story of battles he had survived. Jake tried desperately to think of a way out of this situation. He considered making a run for it, but the dogs had positioned themselves too strategically. Any direction he might choose to flee would require him to get past at least one of them, and Jake was not confident he could outrun any of these animals. He thought about trying to climb onto his motorcycle, but his hands were shaking so badly that he doubted he could even get the key in the ignition. Besides, the dogs were close enough to him that any sudden movement might trigger a response he was not prepared to handle. Jake's breathing became rapid and shallow as panic began to set in. This was exactly how Buddy had felt when Jake kicked his boot toward the innocent golden retriever. This was the same terror that had gripped Charlie the Beagle when Jake made threatening gestures during the dog's peaceful walk. This was the overwhelming fear that had sent Whiskers the cat running to hide under Sarah's bed. For the first time in his life, Jake Morrison understood what it felt like to be completely powerless in the face of a larger, stronger presence that seemed to take pleasure in his fear. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he actually staggered backward against his motorcycle. Bruno took another step forward, closing the distance between them even further. Jake could smell the dog's breath and see every detail of his powerful jaws. The German Shepherd mix was not showing his teeth or making any overtly threatening gestures, but his sheer size and presence were more intimidating than any display of aggression could have been. Sweat was now pouring down Jake's face, soaking through his leather jacket despite the cool morning temperature. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it in his ears, drowning out all other sounds except for the occasional soft movement of one of the dogs adjusting their position. Stella made another soft vocalization, and Tank responded with a barely audible rumble of his own. To Jake, it sounded like they were discussing him, perhaps deciding whether he posed any real threat or was simply a coward who enjoyed picking on creatures smaller than himself. Jake tried to remember every tough guy movie he had ever seen, searching for some way to project confidence and strength in this moment of absolute vulnerability. But all of his borrowed bravado evaporated under the steady gaze of three dogs who seemed to see right through his act. The minutes stretched on endlessly. Jake had no way of knowing how long he had been standing there, trapped in this triangle of silent intimidation. It could have been 5 minutes or 50 minutes for all he could tell. Time seemed to have no meaning when every second was filled with the possibility that his situation might suddenly become much worse. Elena continued to watch from her hiding place, timing the encounter carefully. She wanted Jake to experience enough fear to truly understand what he had been putting innocent animals through, but she had no intention of letting the situation escalate into actual harm. This was about education, not revenge. Marcus remained ready to call off the dogs at a moment's notice, but he could see that Bruno, Stella, and Tank were maintaining perfect discipline. They were creating exactly the psychological impact that Elena had hoped for without crossing any lines that might cause real trauma. Jake's legs began to feel weak beneath him as the sustained fear took its physical toll. He had never experienced anything like this level of helpless terror, and his body was not equipped to handle the stress. After what felt like an eternity to Jake, but was actually only 7 minutes, Elena decided that he had learned enough for one day. She raised her hand and gave Marcus the signal they had agreed upon to end the encounter. From his position behind the hedgerow, Marcus made a soft clicking sound with his tongue that was barely audible to human ears, but crystal clear to his well-trained dogs. Bruno was the first to respond. The massive German Shepherd mix took one last long look at Jake's terrified face, as if memorizing it for future reference, then turned and walked calmly away. His departure was as silent and dignified as his arrival had been, giving no indication of where he had come from or where he was going. Stella followed next, but not before tilting her head one final time and studying Jake with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. The border collie seemed satisfied with whatever she saw in his expression, because she gave a small nod that looked almost human before trotting away in the same direction Bruno had taken. Tank lingered for just a moment longer than the other two dogs. The scared pit bull looked directly into Jake's eyes with an expression that seemed to say he understood exactly what kind of person Jake was and what he had been doing to innocent animals. Then Tank too turned and disappeared as quietly as he had appeared. Jake stood frozen in place for several minutes after the dogs had gone, his body still shaking from the adrenaline and fear that had flooded his system. His legs were so weak that he had to lean against his motorcycle to keep from falling down. Sweat continued to pour down his face, and his breathing remained rapid and shallow. When Jake finally tried to start his motorcycle, his hands were trembling so badly that he dropped the keys twice before managing to get them into the ignition. The roar of the engine, which had always made him feel powerful and important, now reminded him of how terrified those poor dogs must have been when he used the same sound to frighten them. As Jake rode slowly home, his mind kept replaying the encounter over and over again. He could not stop thinking about the helpless fear he had experienced while surrounded by those 3 dogs. The feeling of being completely powerless in the face of creatures who were bigger and stronger than he was had shaken him to his core. For the first time in his life, Jake truly understood what he had been putting innocent animals through with his cruel pranks. The terror he had felt was exactly what Buddy the golden retriever had experienced when Jake kicked his boot toward him. The overwhelming sense of vulnerability was the same emotion that had gripped Charlie the beagle when Jake made threatening gestures during his walk. That night, Jake lay in his small apartment above Tony's Pizza and could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bruno's massive form and intelligent dark eyes. He heard Stella's soft vocalizations and Tank's low rumbles. He relived the moment when he realized he was completely surrounded and utterly helpless. Jake began to think about all the pets he had terrorized over the past months. He remembered the way Buddy had scrambled backward in fear, how Whiskers had run to hide under the bed, how Rex the German Shepherd had cowered behind his owner's legs. For the first time, Jake felt genuine remorse for the suffering he had caused. Over the following days, Jake's behavior changed dramatically. He rode his motorcycle quietly through the neighborhood, keeping his engine at reasonable volume levels and never revving it unnecessarily. When he encountered pets during his rides, he would slow down and give them plenty of space rather than trying to frighten them. Jake even started carrying a small bag of dog treats in his jacket pocket. When he saw a friendly dog during his travels, he would offer the treats as a way of making amends for his past cruelty. Most of the dogs were initially wary of him, but gradually some began to accept his peace offerings. Mrs. Henderson noticed the change immediately. Buddy, who had been refusing their daily walks for weeks, suddenly began showing interest in going outside again. The golden retriever still showed some nervousness around motorcycles, but he was no longer paralyzed by fear when he heard their engines. Sarah Collins was delighted when Whiskers began sunbathing on the front porch again instead of hiding under the bed. Tom Bradley's German Shepherd Rex gradually regained his confidence and was once again willing to walk past the corner where his traumatic encounter had occurred. Belina watched these positive changes from her window as she tended to her garden. She never revealed her role in Jake's transformation, but she smiled every time she saw him being gentle and kind to the animals he encountered. The lesson had been learned, and justice had been served without anyone being actually harmed. Jake never discovered who was responsible for his encounter with the 3 dogs, and he never fully understood how they had appeared and disappeared so mysteriously. But he knew beyond any doubt that the experience was connected to his past behavior toward innocent animals. The neighborhood pets gradually healed from their trauma, helped by Jake's new attitude and the patient love of their devoted owners. Peace returned to the streets of Millfield, and everyone lived more happily ever after.